You know, when we think about state terror, we often picture pure chaos, right? Just random, brutal violence. But what if it's not chaos at all? What if it's a system, meticulously designed and built, almost like a piece of architecture? Today, we're going to dig into the systematic structure of state control under Joseph Stalin, what we can really only call the architecture of Soviet terror.
Every building has to start somewhere. It needs an architect, and it needs a blueprint. So to really get a handle on this terrifying structure, we have to first understand the mind that dreamed it up, and the chillingly simple idea it was all built on. And right at the heart of this whole thing, holding all the plans and directing every single move, was one man, Joseph Stalin. He ruled the Soviet Union as its undisputed, absolute dictator from the 1920s all the way until his death in 1953.
Now this quote, it's not just some dark throwaway remark. It's the ideological blueprint for the entire system. It boils down all the messy, complex challenges of governing a huge country into one brutal equation. If a person or a whole group of people is a problem, then getting rid of them is the solution. This philosophy, in all its horrifying simplicity, would be used to justify the deaths of millions.
So, if you're going to build an empire of total control, where do you even begin? Well, you start at the bottom. You seize the very foundation of society, the land itself and the food that comes from it.
The first move was to rip the foundations of power right out from under the people. For centuries, life in Russia revolved around privately owned land. Stalin's policy of forced collectivization just completely shattered that. It yanked millions of farmers off the land their families had worked for generations and shoved them onto these huge state-controlled farms. And look, this wasn't just about economics. It was social engineering on a massive scale, designed to completely erase the idea of private ownership and crush any sense of individual independence. And once the state has its hands on the entire food supply, well, it becomes a weapon. The state seized grain from the countryside, not to feed the people who grew it, but to feed factory workers or to sell overseas. And this led to unimaginable famine, most infamously the Holodomor in Ukraine. You have to understand, these weren't natural disasters. They were man-made catastrophes, engineered to break the will of the people and cement the state's absolute, total power.
Okay, so the foundation of the country is now firmly under state control. The next phase of construction can begin, and that means getting rid of any human elements that might threaten the structural integrity.
The Great Purge was this terrifying wave of terror that just washed over the entire country. But here's the crucial thing to understand. It wasn't just about eliminating people who were already known opponents. No, the real horror is that it targeted potential opponents. Anyone whose background, whose thoughts, whose connections might make them a threat someday in the future.
And this wasn't random. It was a process, a horrifyingly efficient assembly line of terror. First, enemies were identified, often just to fill a quota or based on a denunciation from a scared neighbor. Then came the arrest, usually that knock on the door in the middle of the night. There was no real trial, just a quick verdict from a committee. And the sentence? It was almost always the same. A bullet in the back of the head or a one-way trip to the camps.
So, what made you an enemy? Well, the state created this very simple black and white world. You were either a perfect little cog in the machine, or you were an enemy that had to be destroyed. The categories were so broad it was terrifying. Had a friend who lived in another country? That could do it. Dared to think for yourself? You're an enemy. Were you a successful farmer, a so-called kulak? That was practically a death sentence. In this system, there was absolutely no room for gray areas, no space to just be an individual.
For the people who weren't executed immediately, the destination was the Gulag. And we're not just talking about a prison system here. This was a gigantic, continent-spanning network of brutal forced labor camps. The Gulag was a key piece of the whole Soviet state. It was designed to do two things: isolate and punish so-called enemies, and build up the nation's industry using slave labor. It was pure terror and economic policy all rolled into one.
All right, so you've got control of the land. You've eliminated millions of people. But how do you hold these two brutal pillars together? What's the mortar that binds this whole architecture of terror? The answer is an all-consuming, pervasive atmosphere of fear. This fear was manufactured. It wasn't just about having a secret police, the NKVD, that could snatch you at any time. It was about creating a total surveillance state, where anyone could be an informant, your coworker, your neighbor, maybe even your own child. All the newspapers and radio stations pumped out state propaganda 24/7.
All art, all books, all music was censored. The real goal was to atomize society, to break the bonds of trust between people until the only one left to trust was the state and its leader. This constant psychological warfare, that was the mortar holding the whole terrifying thing together.
So when you step back, you see it. Stalin's reign of terror wasn't just chaos, it was a system, an architecture, built on three main pillars: total control over the food and the land, the systematic removal of any problematic people, and a psychological state of absolute fear. Each piece held the others up, creating this fortress of control that must have seemed unbreakable. And that reveals a chilling truth about power, leaving us with one last, big question. How fragile are the foundations of our own societies? And what does it take to prevent an architecture like this from ever being built again?